In early April 1786, Philip Dalby, a shopkeeper from Alexandria, Virginia, had come to Philadelphia for a visit. He had come on visits to Philadelphia before, but this one was marked by the Society of Friends, or the Quakers, coming to him and charging him with a lawsuit by his slaves in the hopes of the slave attaining his freedom from his owner. Learning of this impending lawsuit, Dalby enlists the help of Washington, a national hero and celebrity at the time. And although Washington offers no response to Dalby, he does write a letter to his friend and financier, Robert Morris, concerning his opinions of the matter. Now, according to Dalby, he had previously traveled to Philadelphia a year before, in the year 1785, and the same society has approached the same slave with the offer of leaving his master by again presenting a lawsuit against him. The slave had at that time refused. Later on, it was discovered that the slave had performed a small theft, and Dalby had then ordered corporal punishment upon his slave. Now, enraged by this treatment, the slave had then enlisted the help of the Quakers, who approached Dalby with a count of habeas corpus and ordered him to appear before a judge in April 1786. When Washington received the letter, he was still at Mount Vernon, living a life of semi-retirement after his 8 years in the Continental Army. It would be 1 year before he would be summoned to be the President of the United States. But in this letter, although Washington was the slave owner, he still had firm beliefs that the institution of slavery should be abolished. But he also makes it clear that such an abolition should be only done through a lawful plan by the legislation. He also makes it a point to emphasize that the actions of the Quakers are illegal, and considers Mr. Dalby saying this: I give you the trouble of this letter at the instant of Mr. Dalby of Alexandria, who is called to Philadelphia to attend what he conceives to be a vexatious lawsuit respecting a slave of his, which a society of Quakers in the city, formed for such purposes, have attempted to liberate. The merits of this case will no doubt appear upon trial, but from Mr. Dalby's state of the matter, it should seem that this society is not only acting repugnant to justice so far as its conduct concerns strangers, but, in my opinion, extremely impolitically with respect to the state, the city in particular, and without being able, but by acts of tyranny and oppression, to accomplish their own ends. In this part, Washington comments that the means by which the Society of Friends are operating is unlawful, and shares the opinion of Mr. Dalby by saying that Quakers do not have a right to set slaves free by their own means without lawful aid to represent them. Washington's character of respect towards law and order is shown here, and even though the goal was something towards which he supported, if it was not done in lawful means by him, then it should not be practiced, according to Washington. His respect for law and order has been seen in prior events, like when he assumed the position of general over the Continental Army during the Revolutionary War for 8 years. He had one condition, and the condition was that he not be given a salary. This shows his respect for duty, as well as his hopes for a potential nation of America. Later on, during the Whiskey Rebellion in 1794, when Washington was President of the United States, he also commanded his people to respect the law and order of which he had employed by writing petitions to the people, and after when they didn't exactly follow through with those petitions, he did order a military crackdown in Pennsylvania to quell the rebellion when the people refused to listen. In the first section, he adopts a quiet but also critical tone as he addresses his friend and audience, Robert Morris, who actually owned a slave trading sea business years before, and also was a slave owner himself. Washington goes on in his letter to explain the possible effects of what this could have on the city of Philadelphia by saying, Had the case been otherwise, whatever my opinion of the law might have been, my respect for the policy of the state would have on this occasion have appeared in my silence, because against the penalties of promulgated laws one may guard, but there is no avoiding the snares of individuals or of private societies, and if the practice of this society of which Mr. Dalby speaks is not discountenanced, none of those whose misfortune it is to have slaves as attendants will visit the city if they can possibly avoid it, because by doing so they hazard their property, or they must be at the expense, and this is not always succeed, of providing servants of another description for the trip. Washington again states that the Quakers are doing acts illegal according to state legislation. So whenever individuals or private groups like the Quakers believe themselves to be above the law, their acts can become oppressive and tyrannical. He could have also been referencing events like the New York Conspiracy of 1741 when lower-class whites and slaves banded together to rebel because they thought themselves above legislative law. Buildings like Fort George were burned and almost 200 people were arrested because of this rebellion. Also, as a strong believer in Whig-immersed principles, he would also favor the ideal of the sacrifice of individual rights for the better of the nation. Mr. Washington also writes about how a practice could harm Philadelphia by discouraging slaveholders from visiting the city and by causing inconvenience for slave owners to have to hire other help. At the time, Philadelphia was the most populous city in America with about 40,000 people by 1790 and provided crops such as barley and corn to other states, and also linked trade between Pennsylvania and southern ports like southern Jersey. Philadelphia was also considered the most modern city in America, complete with water pumps and 662 street lamps. So the economics of the city would have been very important to Washington. In the third section, Washington writes what can be considered the most vital aspect of the letter and parallels his opinion about slavery next to his opinion about the law, in which he says, "I hope it will not be conceived from these observations that it is my wish to hold the unhappy people who are the subject of this letter in slavery. I can only say that there is not a man living who wishes more sincerely than I do to see a plan adopted for the abolition of it, but there is only one proper and effectual mode by which it can be accomplished, and that is by legislative authority, and this, as far as my suffrage will go, shall never be wanting." Of the entire letter, this section is where Washington is most passionate about his opinion toward Robert Morris and expresses his wish to see the abolition of the slave trade. In prior events, like the Fairfax Resolves in 1774, and also in letters such as the one he wrote to his friend, the Marquis de Lafayette, in 1783, about the abolition of slavery, in which he says, "To encourage the emancipation of the black people of this country from the state of bondage in which they are held is a striking evidence of the benevolence of your heart. I shall be happy to join you in so laudable work." Again, Washington clearly dislikes the institution of slavery, but he is virtuous enough to want to see the end of slavery done by a lawful way, again indicating his ideal that virtue promotes the good of society and not necessarily the individual. In relation to legislative law during Washington's presidency, he takes similar views, like sending Thomas Pinckney and Manuel de Godoy to England in 1796 for Pinckney's treaty. Rather than take illegal action, Washington resorts to civil legal measures to accomplish their goals. Therefore, by any other means, like the ways of the Quakers, slavery cannot be abolished. The only one mean that abolition can take is a route by legislative means. Washington ends on a note that what the Quakers practice border on oppression, not only towards the slave owners, but also towards the slaves, in which he says, "But when slaves who are happy and contented with their present masters are tampered with and seduced to leave them, when masters are taken unaware by these practices, when a conduct of this sort begets discontent on one side and resentment on the other, and when it happens to fall on a man whose purse will not measure with that of the society, and he loses his property for want of means to defend it, it is oppression in the latter case, and not humanity in any, because it introduces more evil than it can cure." 12 years prior, in 1774, Washington had endorsed a set of resolutions known as the Fairfax County Resolves, in which the 17th resolution calls for an end to the slave trade in all colonies. Being a delegate and also a signatory of the document, it can be inferred that Washington indeed was partial to the abolition of the slave trade. However, here, Washington pays attention to note the other end of the spectrum, being partial towards slave owners. It is possible he added this part to keep his national hero facade and possibly to keep his public image where virtues of honor, discipline, and integrity reigned, even though this was a personal letter to his friend Robert Morris. If people were to judge him in terms of being an anti-slavery supporter, Washington could use this argument as something to lessen the criticism if he received such a thing. Washington also performed a similar action before in the Revolutionary War, where he only reluctantly let free blacks and enslaved blacks join the army after it had first been passed by Congress in 1777. Washington goes on to explain that in a case when a slave is content with his life He notes that it is unlawful and immoral to take them away from their life and from their owners. When this practice breeds contempt and also practices something in which someone will lose their property unlawfully, then the practice becomes oppression, according to Washington. The abolition of slavery would be in this way distasteful because the problems it creates outweighs the benefits of the solution it makes. Washington's letter to his friend, Robert Morris, indicates his deep respect towards law and order, even though it interferes with one of his strong beliefs toward the abolition of slavery. Careful not to put all his confidence on one side, Washington addresses both sides of the perspective, offering a torn view on a much debated and controversial topic at that time, slavery.